off my camera. So thanks everyone for tuning back in this afternoon. When I saw Catherine's presentation, I was like, wow, this must be really important because like two people are talking about this subject. It's kind of like when you show up at a party and then someone's wearing the same outfit. I kind of had like the same initial reaction. But my goal today is really to talk about the intersection of trauma and autism, how both experiences can kind of overlap. And my perspective is much more anecdotal. It's more from a limited experience perspective, what I've noticed in my practice working with neurodiverse clients. And I really liked Doc's introduction and prayers this morning because I feel like I'm an ongoing student. So I'm hoping that this presentation will be an opportunity for us to kind of exchange on certain topics, on certain questions, because I am not the expert of the neurodiverse experience. It's different for every individual, and like these individuals are the experts of that experience. Yeah. So let's get started here, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, although I do sometimes struggle with that. So please keep me in check if ever I'm not mindful of the questions in the chat. Okay, so in terms of today, simply to what I talked about this morning, and fantastic about the human response. To focus a bit more on that diagnosis is important, and it takes time. Oh, okay. And I'll talk about a few implications for practice, whether it be like in the workplace, in therapy, continued education. But before we move ahead, I too would like to just highlight this brief land acknowledgement. And I don't want to just acknowledge that, you know, I'm doing this training from my home in Miramichi, which is unceded territory of the Lostoquay and the Mi'kmaq people, but also that I am coming at it from a very white, very Western perspective. I'm a little French Canadian from Edmundston. That's pretty much as white as it gets. So I'm hoping to learn also throughout this presentation from your questions, from your observations, from your remarks. So there is a Q&A period at the end, but if you guys have questions, like just fire them through as we go. So yeah, this is research and information and observations from a very Western perspective. Keep that in mind as we go through today. Okay. Oh, and another little warning before we get started. I am working from home, so I have a 90-pound organic alarm system whose stress response gets activated quite a bit because she keeps me safe from the wind and from passing cars and from delivery people. So if you hear barking, I'm not in danger. It's just my dog's overactive stress response. Okay. Now, beginning of the afternoon, I hope that everybody had the opportunity to have a good lunch and to take what they needed from this afternoon. Okay, so I see, yes, love dogs. We welcome all animals aboard this conference. Yes, thank you. I might get her to say hi towards the end, not throughout, because I don't know if you guys know, but like certain types of dogs are pretty anxious. That's my dog's case as well. And a lot of gnawing and scratching. So all you guys would hear is like her collar go like click, 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 click throughout the presentation. So I might get her to say hi towards the very end. So I hope everyone had a good lunch and moved if they needed to move, relaxed if they needed to relax. Before we jump into this, because we're talking about trauma again, it can be kind of heavy. It can be overbearing at times. I would like to know which one of these images can you guys most relate to? If we're checking in with like our current energy levels this afternoon. Are you more like on top of things, like this little cat up here? Are you feeling kind of lovey-dovey like this rhino and this park's keeper? Are you feeling tiny, like this little toddler in front of a huge statue? Kind of sleepy like the koala? More like in a fight type stance like these penguins? A lot of koalas. I hear you guys. Like I too, like I'm given this presentation and I had lunch too quickly and I'm like, oh God, I might need this to get through my own presentation. Okay, so batteries are feeling kind of low. Do we need to get up? Do we need to stretch? Do we need to move? Another koala. Okay, there's like a theme here. I am feeling a bit koala too. I'm feeling koala and a bit like that toddler that's quite intimidated in front of that big horse. Because it's my first time like talking about my personal experience. So first times are kind of stressful. Yeah. So do we need to stretch? Do we need to get up? Whatever you guys need, take the time to do it. And again, this is trauma. This is heavy. I try to keep it fun. But none of us are blank canvases. We all carry our own stuff. So if you guys need to step out and take a break, I mean, there's no way I'll know either way. So just do it. Yeah. Okay. Any other observations to share? A lot of koalas. Okay. A lot of koalas this afternoon. The second photo sharing, oh, cute, Marisa. Yeah, and I'm really hoping to make a meaningful moment out of this, to share. There she goes. Keeping me safe from the wind. That's all good. Okay, so Catherine did a fantastic job this morning. Really, I applaud you, Catherine. You successfully like explained how our alarm system works, how our internal alarm system works, and how that alarm system, is kind of always scanning the environment for danger. I mean, that's how we survived, right? That's why we're here. So what do you guys think happened to people thousands and thousands of years ago, like our ancestors, when the ones who didn't worry about food, didn't worry about securing shelter, did not worry about enemy tribes, didn't worry about predators, didn't worry about the elements, didn't worry about being rejected from the group? What do you guys think happened to them? Any guesses? People are thinking. Or they're shy. So people who didn't have like that alarm system being on high alert, they probably didn't make it. They were probably a prey of like some other animal or some other group, or they didn't survive. And if you don't survive, you can't pass down those genes, right? So we have the genes of professional worriers, not warriors with like weapons, worriers, people who didn't worry didn't make it. So although like a lot has changed around us, how our brain reacts to perceived threats in the environment hasn't changed a whole lot. So we still have those pretty instinctual responses. And I loved your story this morning, Catherine. It beautifully portrayed how we can shift from one type of stress response to the other. So when this happens, when the stress response is activated, the thinking brain goes offline and we're really focused on survival. And it's meant for short-term survival. Chances are, Catherine, if that rattlesnake had like stayed there and had kind of like run after you in some way or another, I know that's not very probable, but I'm trying to make it work with the rattlesnake example. And if no one had intervened around, after like 15 minutes, like you would have been just drained. You wouldn't have had it in you to fight or flight anymore. You would have just fallen into freeze. So those responses are actually quite useful at keeping us safe. So these automatic responses is just like our brain trying to keep us safe. That's all it is.
Now
Sorry, guys.
Sorry, probably know.
You guys saw good examples of, the different parts of the brain this morning. I don't want to go over it again. Okay. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the polyvagal theory by Porges, Stephen Porges. But anyway, these are like the different states in which humans are in. Yes. Yeah. But we should tell people, Catherine and I met for the first time only like a few weeks ago. Over Zoom, over like some other project. We didn't know each other before. And it's so weird because we have very similar interests and we had like never met each other before. Like we're both like very interested. Well, she's had a much more extensive career, but both interested in the area of neurodiversity, kindred spirits, and attachment approaches, like attachment regulation competency approaches to treat complex trauma, and now polyvagal theory. So interesting. And also acceptance and commitment therapy when it comes to intervention. So just thought I'd mention that. She's like a sister from another mother somewhere. So yeah, coming back on like the polyvagal theory, when we're always scanning the environment for danger, right, guys? So we pick up on like danger cues, but we also pick up on safety cues. So when you go to the same coffee shop every morning and like you have like the same order and that the person on the other end of the counter knows you and they know your order and they greet you and they smile, those are all little signals of safety telling your brain you're safe. Because what's happening is it's not chaos. It's pretty predictable, and predictability equates safety, right? So there's safety, people are being friendly. That's when we're in our kind of like safe and social state, when we pick up on those cues. Now, when we pick up on a danger cue and we assess something as being threatening in our environment, that's when we fall into like the whole fight or flight that Catherine was talking about this morning. And when we're completely overwhelmed, when we feel like either we don't have resources to run away from it, or we don't have the resources to take over the threat, so we can't fight or flight, that's when freeze fawn can kind of kick in, when our resources are just completely overwhelmed. And that's when we go into like sort of a shutdown. Some people will sort of dissociate at times like that. They'll feel like they're completely paralyzed. And the level of stress response depends on the intensity of the danger cues. And I find it really interesting with your example again this morning, Catherine. I'm sorry, I'm like picking on you, but it's so interesting that after your husband put his hands on you, you were able to like go back up a step into like fight or flight. I just find that so interesting. It's like, oh, hands of like someone you love and trust, safety signal, you go back a step. I was like, oh, this is so good. This is such a good example. Yeah. And as Catherine had discussed this morning, the presentation of the stress response varies greatly between genders. First of all, it's like what we're not picking on you at all. First of all, it really had to do with the tend and befriend response, which we tend to see more in non-cisgender males. And sorry, non-cisgender males, not males who aren't cisgender, but people who aren't cisgender males. And also the other thing is we have like certain expectations as to how men will cope with stress, right? There's still today, like we're starting to talk more and more about it, but men are still kind of trapped in that man box where crying and seeking out help from others isn't necessarily encouraged or validated or normalized. I think we can do a better job at it, but that's my parentheses on that. So yeah, the stress response can vary greatly between genders. So we talked about it this morning, the fight flight, it's meant to really mobilize your resources. It's adapted for short-term survival. It's an automatic response. It's not like, oh, I think I'm going to go into fight or flight now. Even before you're aware of there being something that your brain thinks is a threat, your body starts to react before you even realize it's a rattlesnake or that it's like a dangerous animal or some kind of predator. So the neocortex, which is like, all the fancy things our brain can do, all the planning, organizing, use of language, that is taken offline to conserve energy. There's increased blood pressure and heart rate to make sure that your muscles have enough oxygen to fight or to run if they need to. Your liver will release glucose that it had stored to allow you to have energy for your fight or flight, and adrenal and cortisol glands are also fired up, and you get this whole cocktail in your body that allows you to go pretty intense for a short period of time. So, when Catherine kept repeating this morning, trauma stored in the body, the byproducts of stress over time, if you don't find ways to flush that out of your body, it kind of builds up. That's how heart disease, develops. That's how different chronic illnesses develop. I'm not saying all illnesses, but that's a potential pathway. And other than that, even like our sensory systems shift to focus on really high and really low frequencies, because those would be more cues of danger. Because right now, like I'm talking, we're having a chat, that's not particularly high or low frequency. It's a safety cue. I'm just like talking, right? Where something like a thump in like the bushes could be a danger cue, a screech, that's pretty high frequency, that could be a danger cue. And our ear drums actually kind of shift position when we're in fight or flight, which is pretty interesting. Other than that, so the freeze, flock, fawn, faint, it is a physiological response to anticipate death. It's when you feel like your body's did a rapid analysis, it does not have the resources to take on the threat that's there. And it's meant to fully immobilize the body. So a lot of people feel like they can't move, they're paralyzed. There's often a long-lasting impact from a single shutdown response, because then we can beat ourselves up over shutting down when we don't understand what happened. it's like, oh, why didn't I do anything? And then there can be a lot of guilt and shame associated with that, which we deal quite a bit with in therapy. And yeah, it presents like differently in males than females, and faint responses have adapted to colonized society. So faint is oftentimes an option when we can't fight and we can't flight. So let's say you're in a situation at work where you're feeling really overwhelmed and you don't have the option of walking away, and you don't have the option of telling your boss how you feel about them. um, then what are your options? Your thinking brain is offline. So a modern adapted stress response is this over here: scrolling for hours. It's kind of like that numbness, right? So I put up like a little table of what an activated stress response can look like. So, so when you're in fight, you're not necessarily like taking your fists and fighting with someone. Sometimes it's yelling, screaming. You take on a defensive stance towards what feels threatening. So people will notice that all of a sudden they have like kind of watermelon under their arms, or like they're making themselves feel a bit bigger. Sometimes it's viewed as being oppositional or defiant. People can be viewed as acting in a demanding or controlling way. Uh, there are shifts in mood. There's definitely like more irritability, anger, and sometimes verbal aggression. In terms of what flight can look like, it's meant to avoid what feels threatening. So sometimes it can look like, especially when I worked in schools, some students that would become very overwhelmed would refuse to do certain tasks. And and I don't want to poo-poo on the schools either this afternoon, because I do genuinely believe that they're doing the very best that they can. But at that time, the adults working with these teens, or sometimes like young adults, didn't recognize that thinking brains were offline. When they would only see like the refusals, and sometimes the refusals would fall into like fight, and people would raise their voices a bit and get a bit more oppositional or defiant, which are words that I have a hard time using, because when you kind of understand what's going on, you're like, oh, that's not really representative of what's happening here. So yeah, I had like kids who would feel overwhelmed, oftentimes like neurodiverse kids, and just the thought of having to like complete a task completely exceeded their resources, and it was easier for them to say, I don't want to do it, than to say, I don't feel like I could do it right now. So that's what flight can look like sometimes, or when like an employee at a workplace refuses a task, maybe it feels threatening to them. So restlessness, hyperactivity, like difficulty staying at the place, difficulty paying attention. They seem easily distracted by different things around, feeling overwhelmed, like there's just like this wave washing over them, and this urge to like isolate from all the stress, this urge to isolate from people, to in an effort to protect their resources, really. And what can freeze look like? So we had talked about how, like, you become completely paralyzed. Your body's essentially anticipating death. So there's like that blank stare. You can look like you're there, but you're not quite there. You can have a really hard time like finishing tasks, because like, yeah, try finishing a task at work or at school when you don't have access to like your full neocortex. It's hard enough as it is. Imagine when you don't have access to that piece. A lot of like, I don't know, kind of like responses, whether it's like in session with some of my clients, when I notice that they're like kind of like looking around, or they're providing a lot of I don't know responses, that's a cue to tell me like, okay, maybe this person doesn't feel safe right now. A lot of people will describe it as numbness or like dissociation, where they're like, I'm there, but I'm not quite there. They can feel pretty stuck, like they can't move. And the mindless scrolling is a very adapted response to colonized society. Okay. So this is just a cute little analogy to kind of get us to reflect on stress responses. So stress responses don't equate to trauma. Everyone responds to stress. I mean, I've encountered scary animals in the woods, and I didn't develop trauma afterwards because I had a lot of protective factors, like a lot of social support, and I was able to kind of integrate the whole situation. I was able to like make sense of it. I didn't like overly blame myself for it. I had and the extent of like the danger was limited. So just because you experience stress doesn't mean that you will experience trauma. And trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder are two very different things. But I too am trying to provide a more inclusive definition of trauma this afternoon. So for so when you do see like behaviors that you either qualify as like disruptive or where you just like don't quite understand what is going on, take a minute to press pause and ask yourself what's underneath that iceberg. What else could be going on? So in many cases, after like that 15 minutes of like full cortisol, adrenaline, glucose pumping in your blood, you feel safe again. You start to breathe normally again. Your heart rate goes down. And then you just like start to be able to relax a bit. But what happens when that rattlesnake never goes away? Any ideas? System overload. Yes, Nancy. Yes. That's it. So it really changes how we will respond to things. If we're always exposed to like this chronic form of stress in our environment, how we perceive danger, how we respond to it will be changed. It will go in and change the structures in your brain. It will have an impact on your on all the structures of the limbic system, that midbrain, that alarm system, the hippocampus, the amygdala. Yeah. So those we've noted that those structures can experience atrophy. They can kind of shrink with all these stress byproducts pumping through your blood all the time. So what does that look like when the body does not get to go back to baseline for extended periods of time? So I like the definition of trauma by Dr. Bruce Perry because it's a bit more inclusive. Have you guys had the chance to read What Happened to You by Dr. Perry and Oprah? I mean, the title says it all pretty much. It's instead of like focusing on what's on top of that that iceberg. It's really being able to focus on, okay, what happened before? What changed your responsiveness to stress in your environment? So I highly recommend it. What Happened to You? Really good book on helps you understand complex trauma a bit better. So I define trauma as, not I, but Dr. Bruce Perry. I define trauma as an experience or pattern of experiences that impair the proper functioning of the stress response system, making it more reactive or sensitive. So not only does the stress response continue to operate when it's been overly activated, it can become like much more sensitive. So it can be much more easily triggered, is what I'm saying. So what I'd like to talk with you guys about today that's a bit different from this morning is how an overactive stress response impacts development over time. So it impacts development in three main ways. And this is taken from Blaustein and Kinneyberg's 2018 second edition book of the attachment regulation and incompetency. I'll put it in the chat. It's designed for intervention with children, but it has completely changed my understanding of complex trauma, and it has changed my work a lot with adults because I do cognitive behavioral and acceptance and commitment interventions for trauma with adults as well, and that has really changed my understanding. So I'll put it in the chat. Voila. If you don't already have it, I highly recommend it. So there are different ways in which your stress response being activated over and over and over and over again can impact development. And when I talk about development, I mean really those critical years, those formative years between birth and young adulthood. Because technically our brain only stops growing around the age of 25, 30. So my prefrontal cortex only finished developing a few years ago. And as we know that experiences changes how that brain develops. So development has to do with not just like the structures, but in terms of like abilities and skills. Also, what does that look like? So one of the first ways chronic exposure to stress will impact development is that we take a better safe than sorry stance in the world. So when we're scanning the environment for danger, we are much more likely to assume that things are dangerous. So for example, some kids who are in the playground looking at other kids are much like negative information will be much more salient to them. And that memory will be more salient also. When they make memories about those experiences, they're much more likely to remember the negative stuff or the scary stuff because it kept them safe, right? They're still there today. It has a very adaptive function. The thing is, it just can get in the way later on and have them living in a state of pretty permanent fear, which is no fun. So assumption of danger, something that would look neutral for me or someone else might be interpreted as dangerous for someone else. And I have like a really good example on the next page that I want to show you guys. It was like a follow-up of the ACE study. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Events Study. They essentially studied how trauma in early years impacted your health and psychological function built. So yeah, we're much more likely to, oh, thank you. We're much more likely to pay attention to cues of danger. So for example, and danger is not always like an animal. Danger can be perceived rejection, right? Because what part of our brain processes rejection? The same part that processes physical pain. Because way back when, if you were excluded from your social group, your likelihood of survival went. So it makes sense that you pay a lot of attention to that information and that it'd be very painful. So if someone is interacting, let's say, for example, with a group, and someone offers to like share something with them, if their face is like pretty neutral, people who've experienced complex trauma or have experienced a lot of adverse life events are more likely to interpret that neutral face as hostile or dangerous. Another way that an overactive stress response impacts development is that those behaviors that you see on top, that fight, flight, or freeze, people are more likely to engage in those behaviors for one or two reasons. Either because they're seeking physical safety or because they need to fulfill certain social emotional needs. So I have a rule in my office. I don't have a whole lot of rules in my office, but I do have one where when people use the words manipulative, attention seeking, controlling, I tend to press pause and ask to like kind of sit back and think, okay, let's think about the power of words here. That's what we're seeing on top of the iceberg, but what could be going on underneath? Is it possible that the person is fearing like perceived rejection and is acting in such a way to ensure that those needs will be met? Is it possible that that person is casting their line for you to come in and help them regulate their emotions, right? So for example, a very common occurrence in my past practice has been when people make threats to hurt themselves. And when they're like really dysregulated, it makes sense that that's an option that would pop up in their head because their brain is this problem solving machine, right? And when we take the time to like pause and kind of establish safety, I mean like bringing their thinking brains back online. When you weren't given the opportunity to develop the proper skills to ask people for help when you're feeling dysregulated, and when you try that strategy and it works at having people come in to check in on you, it would make sense, right? It's meeting a need. It's meeting a need for safety. It's allowing you to have people come in and check in on you. So I like to replace the words controlling, manipulative, attention seeking with connection seeking. Just let that sit in for a bit. Connection seeking. So that's a really important thing that I like to do in my office. It's an important paradigm shift. When we're talking about like being trauma informed, that's one of the ways. Let's change our language and start seeing things as more, what is the need being expressed here? And then there's interference that form developmental deficits. So if you're focused on surviving, chances are that some of your other skills will get put on the back burner, right? So it's possible that you'll have like highly developed peripheral vision and good like spatial awareness, but when it comes to identifying your emotions and expressing them, you might have like the skills of a 6-year-old, even though you're 25, just because you weren't given that opportunity. You were so focused on surviving because you were exposed to all sorts of things, and that stress response was overactivated. So even though someone is chronologically a certain age, their skills can be like different ages. So, My image isn't showing. I don't know if it's going to pop up. No. But essentially, I don't have the image, but I'll send it to you guys. It's in the Pollack experiment that followed the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Life Event studies. What they did is they showed kids, and I'm just going to show you guys real quick. I'm going to go find it because it's really good stuff. Okay, there it shows. So I'll just show it without showing my presentation, I guess. So can you guys see it now? You can see my blue image there. Yeah, okay, cool. Awesome, thank you. So here we asked a bunch of kids who had not had any adverse childhood life events and some who had had a bunch to identify what was the emotion being portrayed here. So here you have a face that's 100% angry, and here you have a face that's 100% scared, okay? So what they did is with the model, the emotions displayed shift. So they're 90% angry, 10% scared, they're 10% scared, 10% angry, 90% scared. And the kids, so surprise, surprise, the kids with the who had experienced the adverse life events identified all the faces as angry. Pretty mind-blowing, eh? So they identified this here as angry. So it's that better safe than sorry stance going into the world. It's assuming things like, I'm not safe, I'm not worthy of care, other people are hostile. So that can really impact your development if you go through the world with those core beliefs, right? So now I can start my slideshow again. So a series of chronically potentially traumatic experiences. We've talked about it this morning. Just because these things happen doesn't mean that it'll develop into trauma, but it can lead to that. And I just really want to highlight that discrimination, colonization, and structural violence are also events that can lead to the development of trauma. And for a lot of my clients, just going through the school system that was designed for neurotypical kids was pretty traumatic, just because there was a lot of discrimination, and I would say even at times some abuse, some verbal abuse, not just from the kids, sometimes from the adults as well, because they didn't really understand what was going on. The adults, I mean, the adults and the other kids didn't understand what the behaviors that were being displayed meant. So yeah, you guys see that as well, for sure. So I thought this was a really interesting little chart here. And it is free access, so I am able to reproduce it and present it to you guys, and I'll be able to send it to you guys as well. So it talks about the relationship between perceived acceptance by society, self-rated efforts to camouflage, and self-rated measures of psychological distress. And by camouflaging, in that study, what they did is they had like a little sample, like under 100 people, where they asked them to fill out different questionnaires, and the camouflaging questionnaire was they asked people questions like, I listen to a lot of TV shows and then apply that in my interactions with other people to fit in. So those were the kind of questions that they asked. And so the level to which they felt accepted by their family, by their employer, by society in general was negatively associated with camouflaging. So people who felt like they were more accepted in the workplace didn't feel the need to camouflage as much. And people who felt accepted by these different environments reported less symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. And interestingly enough, people who camouflaged more experience more depression, anxiety, and stress. So I thought that was really interesting. It kind of shows the relationship between all these factors that we talked a bit about this morning. And I'm not saying that this will necessarily lead to trauma and will impact development, but it's important to take into consideration that that's a pathway that can happen. So complex trauma, which is a bit more exclusive, really has to do with things that can be like diagnosed more formally afterwards. So in the DSM-5, there's no diagnosis for complex trauma yet. We're waiting for the new version of the DSM. We'll see what it says. But in the ICD-11, there is a code for complex trauma. And what I want you guys to remember here is that it leads to changes and significant difficulties in various areas of function, whether physical, emotional, psychological, right? So something happens. It was early on, it was within the context of care. It took place at a point in your development where you were quite vulnerable, and it led to changes. So just a little snapshot of what that can look like in adulthood. So an adult who does not experience adverse life events and then trauma compared to an adult who does experience quite a few adverse life events. So, when you get to adulthood, that's where your identity becomes a bit more crystallized. You value yourself on what you bring to the world. Now, that's a very Western view where like your value is very much determined by what you bring, not just by who you are. So in that sense, we've learned a lot from our Indigenous friends. So it's also an age where you start to become more and more independent in your ability to regulate your own emotions. So when you get emotional support from like friends, family, coworkers, it tends to be like more instrumental. It's when the distress is like really high. Most of the time you're able to kind of white knuckle your distress. And it's where some cognitive and interpersonal skills continue to develop. Your brain only stops developing when you're 25, 30. So there's still like ongoing changes. For people who've experienced quite a few adverse life events growing up, sorry guys, that can really impact their functioning across various domains. And when we talked about like that dual process, so they might have like the average abilities of an adult when it comes to, I don't know, doing their taxes or like going to work and following a schedule. But when it comes to, interacting with other people, when it comes to how they view themselves, when it comes to all kinds of different abilities, they might not be at the chronological age of an adult, right? Because they didn't have that luxury. Those skills were put on the back burner when they were growing up. And by having their stress response like easily activated, that can really interfere with different areas of functioning, whether it be in interpersonal relationships, whether it be at work, whether it be with friends. So these people might have more difficulty making and keeping friends, or they might have more difficulty keeping a job. And you'll see that there's a lot of variables in adulthood, right? There's a lot of things that can happen in a lifetime. So it's really different for everyone. So there's not like, this is what an adult who's been impacted by trauma looks like. Keep in mind that there's a very broad range of possible effects. So I thought this was really interesting. So Paul Mikolev is not a mental health researcher. He's an engineer, and he has his own YouTube channel called Asperger's from the Inside. And his videos are very informative and like well researched. So I invite you guys to check it out if you haven't already. And there was this quote in one of his videos, and I was like, oh, that is so telling, where he says, if you want to understand autism, you need to understand trauma. And I was like, whoa, kind of mind blown. And I'm not saying that, everyone with autism has trauma. That's not what I'm saying at all, but it's just in trying to understand the reactivity of our nervous system. It really helps us kind of see how the two can overlap. Yeah. Yes, very telling indeed. So just a few findings from the literature. So I'm worse than Catherine at managing time. I have like 5 minutes left. So I won't get into like the whole nitty gritty of the literature, but essentially in looking at the most recent research, I've noticed that people with autism are much more likely to experience trauma for a variety of reasons, whether it be because caregivers really struggle with some of the challenging behaviors. Yeah, we'll have to do another conference soon. I know. I'd like to do a conference just for like workplaces so they can make their workplace more inclusive would be like my dream conference. Like, so I'm putting it out there. But yeah, no, we'll definitely need to do another one. But from the so how people can be more likely to experience trauma. So higher rates of bullying, because there's much more vulnerability there in terms of like understanding what people are telling you, in terms of like understanding sarcasm and accurately reading people's intentions is something that's really difficult for some of our neurodiverse people. So it makes it more likely that they'll experience these varieties of potentially traumatic incidents. And their nervous system is also prone to be more reactive, which I thought was really interesting. And I also just want to briefly mention the hidden harms of previous treatment approaches. So previous, really evidence-based approaches. And now these kids are growing up and telling us, well, that was pretty harmful, actually. So when it comes to like applied behavior analysis, I know that people are more mindful of that nowadays. And I'm not saying that all ABA leads to trauma. It's not what I'm saying, but it's just, it can be very harmful in a sense that people feel like they don't have any agency. And it can actually, and there, whenever there's no opportunities to like co-regulate or to like meet the needs, and instead it's met with like no response when like the intended behavior is not displayed, you're teaching kids to like, well, you have to white knuckle your distress, and no one's going to help you out with this. So that's just something I want us to keep in mind. Yeah, so I see like, ooh, that like fired up quite the discussion. Yeah, noted. So I'm like, know better, do better is kind of what I'm trying to do. Because I, as someone who did a lot of assessments when I started, I would like recommend ABA left and right as soon as there was like an autism diagnosis. But now I'm a bit more mindful, and I get to like know the practitioners a bit better in the province. And I know who does kind of what. And I think ABA can be useful if it's really focused on being proactive and putting the relationships first, because there are ways that ABA can do that. And in that sense, it can become very trauma informed. So in terms of the overlap of the symptoms, oftentimes trauma gets missed because of how autism can present, and vice versa. So I just wanted to put like this little Venn diagram out there to kind of show you guys how much some of the presentations overlap. So we get a better understanding of how both can present. And please note that like sometimes it's possible to have both. It's possible to have autism and trauma. It's not because you have one that you can't have the other, right? So a lot of shared characteristics. So an overly active stress response, emotions that go like up and down, being always kind of on edge, having difficulty with planning, organizing, having difficulty understanding people's intentions and emotions as we're talking to them, because we've seen that that's not unique to autism. People who've experienced complex trauma can have a really hard time reading facial cues accurately as well. So self-stimulating behaviors that need those needs for safety, that need for control, or people that we label as manipulative or controlling, obsessing over certain thoughts, difficulty feeling close to others. And that's where it's really important, right? When we make the differential diagnosis, what is making you feel like you can't be close to others? Is it because like you feel like you're different, or is it because you feel like you can't trust others? So it's really about digging in to see, okay, what is the cause of that characteristic there? And so on this side here, you'd have like what a healthy neurodiverse individual could look like. Sensory profile that's like specific, so heightened sensitivity to sight, sounds. It's not necessary to meet the criteria for autism, but it is an associated characteristic a lot of the time. The intensity of interests, and the feeling drained after going out socially and being social for a few hours. It asks a lot more of our neurodiverse friends than the neurotypical ones. And there are characteristics of trauma that you will see in people who don't necessarily have autism that will appear. So anhedonia is just the inability to experience positive affect. So important thing, an important distinction: autism is something that you are born with. Trauma is something that happens after something very scary happened to you. Just to put it out there, you're not born with trauma and you don't develop autism later in your life. So the onset of the symptoms is also another important factor that helps us make an adequate differential diagnosis. So I'm over time. Just a few implications for practice, that things that I have thought about now that I know a bit better. So I will send you guys the slides that have a bit of information on them as to like how to think about doing these different things. But I think the most important one, now that we know what happens to the human stress response when our thinking brain goes offline, when what happens to a lot of neurodiverse people as they try navigating the neurotypical world, we know that they're much more likely to experience trauma. So I think it's important that we make our approaches trauma informed, because there's no harm in making your approaches trauma informed. There's much more harm to not adapting your approach and them being not trauma informed, to having someone who didn't experience trauma and assuming trauma anyway. That won't harm them. So making your approaches trauma informed is a win-win strategy. So there are different ways to establish safety. So you can make sure that your organization, like decisions, are really informed by trauma. So you're more than just aware of the potential impacts of trauma, like we've talked about today. It really influences your decision making in your organization. One of the things that helps establish safety when I meet with clients in my office is I establish a session routine. So they know exactly what we're going to do. There's no surprise. And predictability increases that sense of felt safety, because oftentimes a lot of things were pretty chaotic and unpredictable for some of our clients who've experienced adverse life events. And one strategy that can be very useful, that can go a really long way, is the absolute opposite of what I did this afternoon, and is listen. So really listen, just really listening and showing the person that you're listening and that you're not judging them, so that you're like kind of nodding your head, you're repeating things that they said to make sure you understand correctly. If you notice that their voice rises, or that there seems to be like a shift in how they're displaying emotion, you just kind of note it in a non-judgmental manner. You validate and you normalize their emotions, like, oh my, like that must have been scary for you. That is one of the ways in which you can help the thinking brain get back online. We're social creatures. Self-regulating when you're too distressed can be potentially traumatizing. So if there's like one thing I want you guys to take away from this presentation, is that being attuned, so being in sync with the emotions that are being displayed with the person, and taking the time to listen and not judging and not coming in with a hidden agenda of getting them to change their emotion right away, that goes a really long way. Yeah. So I will send you guys my slides. I went over 5 minutes. So sorry, guys. But I really appreciate everyone tuning in. I don't know if we had like time for maybe a couple of questions.
Yeah, do we have any questions? Thank you, Valerie, so much. Wow, I'm learning so much today. But if we have any questions,
cool.
Feel free to unmute your mic or to put it in the chat box.
Oh, thank you, Melissa.
Perfect. So we will, if there are any questions, I'm sure Valerie doesn't mind. Oh, it was very informative. That's from the MBCC class.
Ah, cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's awesome information. It really is. It's really helpful. Thank you.
Cool. Thank
you,
guys.
Appreciate you taking the time today out of your busy schedule to spend it with us. So it means a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys for the invitation. It's I'm a student today too, so
aren't we all? That's great. All right, so we will move forward with, so I would like to welcome Matt and Cameron from MBACL's Social Inclusion Program. I believe they have some housing resources. And I would like to thank you both for popping on last minute. I know Tabitha couldn't be with us today, so thank you for, being cooperative and stepping up to the plate. So I'd like to welcome you both.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is Matt. I'm with the New Brunswick Association for Community Living in the Social Inclusion Program. The association for the province is a nonprofit organization that supports individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And within the social inclusion program, Cameron and I and the rest of our team support individuals aged 17 to 64 with an intellectual or developmental disability. And our three main facets that we support are community connections. So working with those individuals who might have some social isolation or just looking to expand their inner circles to make new friends, make new connections, gain experience for employment. We set up those goals and work through maybe the barriers and the different steps to get those folks involved in areas of their interest. And that could be, like I said, experience of volunteering for work experience or just recreation and leisure things. The second area is personal support networks. Cameron's going to touch on this a little bit in his part of the presentation, but personal support networks is essentially the circle of more natural supports that are in an individual's life. So family, friends, maybe coworkers, maybe classmates if they're in any kind of university or college, people that they bump into that they build a relationship with, that are available for support in kind of whatever the situation is. So we're going to be talking about housing today. So if the individual is going to be looking to move out on their own into their own apartment, that support network is really, really, really important because, as all of us, right? We all have some sort of network. I remember when I was fresh out on my own, I tried to do it on my own and failed miserably because I thought I could do it without mom and dad and my brother who's experienced it before. So it's really important to have those supports in place. And the last area is the supported living arrangements. So Cameron and I in the coordinator roles really focus on arranging and establishing supported living arrangements for folks who want to move out on their own. And like I said earlier, our program covers the ages between 17 and 64. And sometimes we get students like fresh out of high school who are ready to move out on their own. Some are in their 30s, 40s. You know, I'm working with a few individuals right now who are in their 50s who will be living on their own for the first time. So it really is a PACE-driven, goal-driven program where we want to establish that trust and that confidence that we can set them up for success in the different areas of supported living. The important thing to know is that we are not a housing program. We are a support program to access different housing resources. So we work a lot with the Department of Social Development and the NB Housing Program. And we really just try to facilitate the conversations and maybe provide some extra advocacy depending on the situation. So that way individuals can access the housing support with NB Housing. And that usually looks like some sort of supplemented rent. We really strive for portable rent subsidies, which is a subsidy that is attached to the person and can be applied to any kind of apartment in any kind of real area that they're working in. Aside from, or I guess in contrast to a subsidized unit or a subsidized building where that individual unit, that apartment is subsidized through the housing program. And if something were to happen, an eviction, a fire, anything like that, that individual is kind of being placed back onto the housing wait list in order for another unit to become available. So we work really closely with the Department of Social Development, like I said, in NB Housing to make sure kind of all the boxes are getting checked for this process to make sure that there is some extra supportive advocacy is needed. And then we also work with support. So a lot of these, we call it the supported living arrangement because a lot of these folks, when they move out, do need extra supports in their home. Some could be a few hours a week. Some could be 24/7 supports around the clock in the home with them. Like I mentioned earlier, those personal support networks are great, but can do so much before there's burnout with family and friends. So we work with, again, the department to in other NBACL programs, the Independent Facilitation Program, to make sure that those supports are in place. And if there's private, we work with the families and the individuals to go through the hiring process. If it's agencies, we kind of make sure everything's going well on both ends of things to maintain that relationship and really make sure that those supported living arrangements are successful. And once individuals are kind of in our program and set up and we're walking along with the progress, we're there for, of course, crises situations. Something happens with the rent, something happens with their apartment. So we're there again to provide some support. We really want to see individuals self-advocate for themselves. So providing those tools and those resources and maybe even some role playing on the phone or in person so that they can go have the conversation with the landlord or with the neighbor or with the department to advocate for themselves. And there's something else that I was going to say and it's just skipped my mind and I don't see it in my notes. So I will pass it along to Cameron. We already had this discussion about an hour ago just to say, if I miss something, please pick it up and make sure it's covered. So I will pass it on to Cameron. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So we'll do our best to fill in each other's gaps. Yeah, my name's Cameron. I'm actually up in Bathurst, so not so far from you folk in Miramichi. So what Matt was telling you about, the broad overview of the program is really good high level of what we do. Unfortunately, as you kind of know, we aren't in the Miramichi area, but what I want to do is kind of share with you some tips and tricks of how you can kind of almost replicate what we do in a more kind of formal capacity. And so I'm going to go over some things that everybody can keep in mind. And some of them are not going to seem directly related to housing. I know that's what we're talking about kind of more specifically, but some of them can kind of fit into, kind of like Matt was saying, when we're talking about a plan, it's going to be very paced. It's going to be very over time. Like sometimes when we're talking about a supported living arrangement, we're talking about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, up to 5, 10 years, depending on the person and what they might have in terms of resources, in terms of the nature of their disability, that sort of thing. So kicking it off, the first thing that I would want people to consider is being creative. So, considering your budget, how you can maybe take what you have and make something work for you. So every individual at a certain point in their life would have access to income assistance through social development. So that's one thing that is not specifically related to housing that should be taken advantage of as early as possible. And then with that, depending on the severity or the nature rather of the disability, you could advocate for higher rates. So that can really be helpful for a lot of different people when it comes to striking out on their own. Matt referred to his own living situation when he was striking out on his own. And for me as well, like a lot of us, we don't just find an apartment and successfully live on our own. We start off with roommates. So that's one area that a person might consider looking at is a roommate or roommates. And that could be something that you really have to explore over time and make sure that that's something that the person is comfortable with. Not everybody is going to be able to enter into a blind relationship. So maybe you're going to have to get to know the person over time. And so that's something to keep on the radar. Other things I'll just kind of gloss over quickly, and that's something that you would explore with a social worker at social development, but alternative family living arrangements or live-in roommates. So an alternate family living arrangement can kind of help a person, get out of the family home and use that as a period of maybe developing their kind of plan to get to the next stage. Sometimes people do stay in alternative family living arrangements for a while, but it all depends on the person. And the live-in roommate, that would be where it's like a subsidy where a roommate gets to live with that person for free, but then has certain duties attached to it. So that, again, is more of something that you would want to explore with a social worker. So again, NB housing is one of the big tools that all New Brunswickers have that at their disposal. Unfortunately, there are wait times. That is why, again, we always are trying to temper expectations in terms of how fast we can kind of accomplish these things. So then within our program, we kind of state we're not really crisis management, so we can't necessarily help with a loss of housing, but we're always going to be there to help, with a long-term plan. And the big thing, like Matt said, is we're trying to achieve for a lot of people is portable rent subsidies. So that allows people to pick where they live and have, greater success in those arrangements. So some tips around that too, in increasing your odds maybe of getting a portable rent subsidy, is to consider the individual and how you might be able to grow capacity. So what I mean by that is, can you look at the skills that person might have and what might they need when it comes to living independently on their own? So that's kind of like a big thing you might want to look at in terms of developing that plan. Basic things that we might take for granted, like, cleaning the kitchen and doing your dishes, housekeeping, meal preparation. And actually, that's one other place that I'd like to tie in one other resource that you can consider. Again, non-housing specific, but the disability support plan, that can be accessed at 18. You can start to develop it with a social worker. And then when the person turns 19, they can access different things like a human service counselor or personal support worker, depending on what they need. Some of the people that Matt and I might support have disability support plans. They have support workers. And they, for instance, one person that comes to mind for me, they're working on different things around being more comfortable in the kitchen, working with a stove, feeling confident with those types of things. So that's important that you have that type of thing started and in progress, as early as possible. There's no real timeline that is, that we can have a mold that fits for everyone. It's going to be really dependent on the person, but again, it's going to depend on their network. So we grow capacity at the individual level, but we would also want to grow capacity at the community level. And for that person, Matt kind of talked about it, the personal support network and the importance that plays. So what does currently, for instance, the mother, the father, grandmother, grandfather, maybe brother, sister, what are these people doing that maybe they might have to keep doing, or are there gaps that we might need to expand the network and find more people to contribute to that person's life? So that is going to tie into my next thing, but I just want to quickly go over 2 other resources that are more housing related. And again, this is going to be long-term. Not everybody is going to be able to access these, but the first is the first-time home ownership program through the government of New Brunswick. So that you'll be able to find through social development. And they, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, they will grant a $75,000 loan, repayable, but it's no interest, and they kind of are trying to make it easier for people who are in precarious housing, like substandard housing, to become homeowners. So that's one thing to consider. Again, not everybody's going to qualify. It is a long process, but it is really valuable, worth considering. I know I said I was only going to just 2 things, but one other thing, people can look up pathways to home ownership online, and it's a recent publication that came out with Inclusion Canada, which is kind of the mother organization of NBACL at the national level, but also People First Canada, which is a organization of self-advocates who came together to develop this housing strategy guide. And I kind of have been glossing over it this week, and it's really interesting to see the variety of people and the variety of ways in which they all became homeowners. And kind of as Matt alluded to earlier, people are going to achieve this at different times in their lives. We support 17 to 64, and that was really reflected in that guide. Everybody kind of had their own timeline and their own strategies, but all of them were able to achieve home ownership. And really quickly, just to touch on it, there is a home repair program that people can access as well for, I believe both these programs are, the threshold might be 40,000. If you earn above that, you may not qualify, but a lot of people that we support are not above that threshold. So good options to consider in long-term plans. Okay, so getting back on track to the community, the personal support network, if you do need to identify more people, this is where, again, you are going to want to get creative. A lot of times we're talking about natural supports. Maybe it's neighbors. Maybe it's that person at the coffee shop that knows you, knows the person that is, and can kind of help people navigate challenging situations in the community. So we want to be always looking for new experiences, new friends, and help that person to expand their, again, what we call personal support network. And quickly, we wanted to touch on something called PATH, and it's a resource that anybody at NBACL can tap into. So I know we are not represented in the Miramichi region as the social inclusion program, but we do have an office there and other programs. So basically what PATH is it's a visual way of making a plan, and it actually stands for Pathways to Alternative Tomorrows with Hope. So, depending on who you are, you might find that a little cheesy, but I've done one, I've done a few, and I believe Matt would have as well. And they're very useful tools, not just for making a plan, but for the individual to be able to make a plan and have it come from their mind, their voice, versus what mom and dad might think, or their grandmother, grandfather. Of course, those voices are important, but we want to be following the path. Okay, yeah, that's great. We are also doing a revamp training this spring, so I don't have my training personally, but I'm looking forward to taking it. And definitely a worthwhile endeavor for anybody who might lack clarity in where they see themselves going in their life. And then you have a chance of having a goal, laying out the steps, working backwards, and then you can work forwards from there. And as Matt and I were talking about it, we were kind of talking how it's a good tool for when you are stuck. You can always, suggest to the person, look at your path, look back to your path, and find your way forward. Okay, so again, I'm going into some non-related housing strategies, but again, we might be working with a limited budget, so we might want to consider employment. And I think that is probably something that it seems like the organizer of this conference is aware of, the importance of employment. And not only that, the importance of employment and having an income, but where a person, with autism or any other disability, developmental or intellectual, might not have the same type of valued roles that we have in life. So, we take a lot of positive benefit away from having a job, not just a paycheck, but the human relationships, human connections that come with it, having coworkers, again, meeting new friends, meeting new people, new experiences to help them along the way. So that is, again, just another way of increasing their odds when it comes to not just having more people in their lives for their network, but even I want to just circle back really quickly on the portable rent subsidy. So not everybody accesses these easily. You can get on the NB housing waitlist, which everybody should do if they're seeking to be part of that program. And then the portable rent subsidies, they come around only so often. So if you are advocating for yourself or, a family member, and it can be demonstrated the reason why it's important for them to have access to a portable rent subsidy. For example, they have a job in this area of town, and if they were able to live there, they could walk to and from their job. And then you can enumerate all the positive benefits that would come from that. So that's one strategy that we use, and it can be successful. It really depends on a lot of factors. There is no true wait list at NB Housing. It's kind of based on a lot of factors, like if there's people who need to be housed versus somebody that is in a stable housing situation, then they might not be as high up on that process. But anything that you can do to kind of show that you have a plan, you're working towards different goals, can help you with that successful portable rent subsidy advocacy. And yeah, lastly, I just wanted to tie it in really quickly, that employment part, to just what we do offer in the Miramichi area through NBACL. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I think I can. Okay. So that's what I was talking about, if you do go online to look for it. But that's not actually what I want to show people. Sorry. I can't access it because of the bar in the way. Sorry, everybody. Here it is. Okay, here we go. So we do have an employment counselor in Miramichi named Marissa. And she would be another resource to people in that area who are seeking employment. But we also have for people who are still in high school and looking to make plans for their future and transitioning out of high school and into either post-secondary education. There's Angie, who is our transition facilitator, but also Hazel, who does transition to adult life, which is similar yet more going out of, as far as I understand, going out of high school more into job, community living type of thing. And we also have Catherine, who is an independent facilitator, and I think that would be a really good person. I know, excuse me, a lot of you might already be aware of employment, different employment programs in Miramichi, but Catherine is an independent facilitator and can help people develop disability support programs, or plans rather, and she could also help people tap into a path, and path being that plan that people can refer back to. So that is kind of in a nutshell what we offer in the Miramichi area at this time. And some of our tips and tricks for successful housing strategies. I wish we had a social inclusion program in Miramichi. I think we would, at NBACL, we want to have all our programs everywhere, but unfortunately it is just not the reality. But yeah, that's kind of our presentation in a nutshell. I don't know, Matt, if you have any thoughts of anything I may have missed or anything else you wanted to add before maybe we do want to have a question or two as well.
Yeah, we can open it up for questions. I posted a link in the chat for everybody as well for the contact information for our provincial offices in the different regions. And as Cameron was mentioning, like we don't offer the social inclusion program right now in the Miramichi region. However, two things if anybody takes away anything right after the presentation is that one, anybody can request a pass from any of our NBACL offices. So if you are in the Miramichi region, and then that might be something that you or an individual you know are supporting would really benefit from, and it's not just housing, it's for any kind of life goal planning, school, education, increasing their circle of friends, that can be accessed and requested at any of our regional offices. And the really cool thing about it is, like, if I'm going to put on a path for somebody that I'm supporting, I'm going to be sitting in the background taking notes, and two really unconnected NBACL facilitators are going to host it. That way there's no bias. You know, I can't ask a question when I already know the answer, or kind of guide the individual somewhere where I know that is really what they want to do. So I sit back and shut up and somebody else does it. So it's a really great opportunity. And as well, like, there was a lot of information shared with us not being in every region in the province. You can still give us a call. You can still call us, and depending on the region and our own capacities and our schedules, we can offer kind of a 1 hour session on this information that's a little bit more specific to you or whoever you're supporting. If you're not, like, if you're in Miramichi or in other areas that we are not in the social inclusion program, we can definitely offer that kind of more specific training, we'll call it, and then it kind of sets you up with more information and context for your housing journey. So, but yeah, if there's any questions for Cameron or I, we'd love to give you the opportunity to ask away.
Thank you guys for coming today. Last minute, I know it was probably a shock, but thank you. It was wonderful. What a great resource.
Yeah.
And the link that you posted, we will share to our Facebook page as well, and have that available to everybody for any time that they could use it. But I really appreciate you guys popping on, and feel free to stay